I am here with the exquisite Kate Vandevender, and she is a screenwriter, showrunner, and she's just launched a studio called Sand Mirror Studio, which is a new methodology that she created to help creatives tap into themselves and their intuition and their purpose in a more meaningful way. But Kate is someone who just has a deep, deep zest and curiosity for life that you feel in her work, not only in the process, but in how she speaks about it. It is so joyful to be in her presence, to spend time with her. So I'm just so excited for you guys to meet her today.
Thank you so much. This is awesome to be here.
Thanks for being here. So before we get into your new venture, I would really just love you to take us through your road in Hollywood, which led to this epiphany and discovery of what your next sort of chapter should be.
Sure. I moved here from New York. I'm from New Mexico originally. Moved here from New York after being an actress and a mime and an editor in New York.
A mime?
A mime. I was
Like
a professional mime.
Like in theaters or on the street?
No, not on the street. We considered ourselves very above that. We only performed in theaters. We had 2 shows, one for adults, one for kids. And yeah, it was actually how I learned storytelling. I learned to tell stories without words, which was extremely difficult because if you know, the audience is tracking your movement, so if you mess up a line, they don't know what you're doing. So
Right.
it was really, it was an awesome way to learn. It was really
Very
difficult.
intentional. And we're going to plant the seed now. We'll talk about it later, but it obviously somehow informs what you're doing now.
Yes, I think that was my first introduction into physical storytelling and the importance of bringing ideas into physical form and shape, shapes in space. So anyway, my mime career was short, and I moved to LA. I moved here to be an actress. The first thing I did was I made a web series back when web series were just starting to come out, and it was about an actress named Kate, and it went viral. I ended up getting really good representation, some contracts, and I turned into a writer. I was very sought after as a writer more than an actress. And so I made my way up in comedy. I wrote on some sitcoms, and I reached a point where I felt like I was seeing behind the scenes of how things get made in Hollywood, and it was unbearably toxic.
You said this thing to me once around the language that we use in Hollywood, and it's very, like, sort of masculine leaning. Can you just walk us through sort of like some of those references and sort of like the methodology that you realize it skews very much one way, and it should be, with everything, should be balanced?
Yeah, I started to notice in the writer's room in particular, when we are working on a script, we use language like we beat out the story, and we find the punchline, and we do it until it kills, and we break a story, and we do a vomit draft. So it's like really violent language to describe the creative process. And it just got me thinking, like, why are we defining creation in terms of destruction? Doesn't make any sense. And that is what it feels like to be in a comedy writer's room, or a lot of writer's room. It feels like a war. And so I started to think, what would the product look like if we actually supported the creative process with creation, with what you would need to actually create things. And so I left the writer's room, and I started to investigate where inspiration comes from, what creativity is, because I started to think that so much of what people get stuck on is they don't actually know how inspiration comes into the brain. They don't know how it works. And I thought, that's just horribly inefficient. If there was a way to discover how inspiration happens, then we could replicate it all the time, and it wouldn't be such a pain to make anything.
Because when I think of creativity, I think that it can't be, like, I think there's a sense of urgency in our culture around production and creativity, and it's hard for me because I'm like, creativity comes when it comes. Like, when I give a keynote talk, it's like I write it, and sometimes, it's not done until it's done. It's like no matter how much I want it to be done, it's not done until the one thing comes into my brain, or I read the thing, and then it goes in the product, and then all of a sudden the keynote's finalized, right? And so in the process of understanding how inspiration comes and works, can you walk us through sort of what you learned?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, so there's two important things to know. One is creativity is inspiration, and paired with, I would call it sort of a morphogenetic field of what that creation wants to be. And that's sort of...
Can you explain for us that may not know what a morphogenetic
Yes.
field is?
Yes. So morphogenetic field is something that is researched both in science and in psychology and spirituality. And on the science end, the scientists are interested in, we all are created from one cell. We all start with one cell, and that cell multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. And eventually those cells somehow know that some of them are going to be an arm, some of them are going to be an eye, some of them are going to be a brain, even though they all come from a single cell. So there's sort of this question of like, how do cells know what part of the human architecture they're going to be? On the psychological, spiritual side, when we get an idea, there is a sense that there's sort of like a holographic blueprint in your brain. You can kind of like sort of feel into what the idea wants to be, and then you start manifesting and sort of filling in the blueprint of what that idea is. So both of those things are based on something that's called a morphogenetic field. And in science, there's a lot of debate around it because we don't have the instruments to detect something like that. It's a highly sensitive thing, but on the creative side, creatives are highly sensitive. So if you speak to someone who's had an idea or trying to birth a creation, they know exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
So that's what a morphogenetic field is. It's something that holds space as the idea and brings reality into it in a particular way until that entire idea is manifested. So a creation is inspiration and a morphogenetic field that then becomes realized by reality. Now the trick is that inspiration is actually much more accessible than most people think. And one person that did a lot of research on this is Carl Jung, who's one of the forefathers of psychology. And what Jung discovered, which is so helpful, is that our brains process a few different kinds of information. We process perceptions, we process emotions, we process sensations, and thoughts. And when all four of those things are aligned with each other, something else happens in the brain, which is your inspiration center opens. So,
Please repeat that again, just
Yeah.
so we can all take it in.
so our brains process thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions. So
Okay.
you've got all this data coming into your brain, what you're feeling, what you're sensing, what you're thinking, what you're just everything around you, inside and outside. So as you're processing this information, some of those things are in conflict with each other, right? Like you're having a thought like, I want to do this, but you're having a feeling of fear. Don't do this. So those two things are against each other. They're not aligned. And this creates kind of a traffic jam in the brain. And in those situations, it's the part of your brain where inspiration comes in doesn't open. It's like a flower that only opens in certain circumstances. Now, your brain can become aligned in fear, or it can become aligned in a love state. So, like, for example, if you were being, chased by a hungry wolf, then you would see the wolf, that would be your perception. You would feel afraid, like, I need to run. Your body would be giving you all sorts of signals like, yes, we need to run. And so all the data in your brain becomes aligned and focused into one thing, and suddenly your instinct opens up, right? Run, I'm gonna save myself.
Your inspiration flower.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that happens often when we have a deadline. That's that fear state coming in.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
So that's what we have used as like an adrenaline, productivity-focused way
it's very primal.
of creating inspiration.
Yes.
So for me, the recipe that I use, which is my terminology, but not different than Carl Jung's, is stillness, new stimuli, and like space. So like for me, when I'm traveling, I'm often very inspired, largely because it's quiet, I have new stimuli, and I have the breadth and luxury of time and space.
Yes. What you're doing is great because you have recognized that you're actually doing creativity in a more sustainable way. So if you're...
You heard it here first.
If you are a person who forces yourself into creativity by, depending on a deadline to run into and put yourself in a crisis state. That's ultimately not sustainable because you're going to start to pair like anytime I need to create something, I need to suffer.
Well, it's a lot of people. It's a lot of artists who equate
people.
that pain equals creativity,
Yeah.
and they feel like if they are happy or well, then they won't be able to be as creative. And this is across so many creatives that I know. That is exactly what they tell me. And they're afraid, so you're comfortable in your discomfort because you're afraid if you get more healthy or comfortable, you're going to lose what you believe is your key to inspiration.
Yes, and that is a way you can create from that state, but it's not sustainable. It is very supported by industry, like you can control people if they're working in their fear state very easily. So there's not a lot of discussion or thought leadership around how to actually bring people into the process that you're doing, which is creating from a love state, a relaxed state, a pleasure state. And that is, it turns out, not only as effective or more effective, but sustainable, pleasurable. You'll create more over time because you actually like it. Mm-hmm. So good job, you found the key to creativity.
I see both sides though. I see both sides. I've done the thing where like when you're sad, you feel like, oh man, I could write 8 books of poetry from this pain, and I feel that too. Mm-hmm. But what I've learned is that if I can give myself environments, for me, new stimuli is a big part of the equation, is that I just find that like it's a very generative process.
Yeah.
And I think it's been my key to be like, this is how creativity can live. So I love hearing Young's version because I came to my own sort of conclusion in a similar way.
And actually, that's what I built my whole studio around. So the studio's it's called Sandmere Studio. It is taken from a Jungian psychologist who was, she was working with kids, and she realized like kids don't have a lot of verbal skills, and so she developed this system that involves a sandbox, a library of little figurines and toys that she uses as archetypes and symbols, and they're kind of all on the wall. And it's this very physical experience where you go, there's like relaxing music, and you go and you have you create a block that you're bringing into the studio, and there's a guided process with me, the way I use it, to pick the symbols and archetypes so you can kind of like very gently, effectively, efficiently download what your block is or what your idea is and see it in front of you, and then you can work with it.
I know for people watching and listening, I too, when I first heard this, was intrigued but also skeptical because I think all of us should have a healthy level of skepticism. But I want to say that I have done Kate's process, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating. Like you come in with a question, or I mean, you can explain it better than me, but you come in with some sort of, I guess, inquiry. Is that the right way to put it?
Yeah. So, and it helps if you're desperate. Like crisis, it helps if either you're passionate or desperate. Like that's sort of a really good fuel to use.
I think also I'm going to say it helps if you're extremely open.
Yes,
it does. I think you can be skeptical and still be open.
Yeah.
And I think you have to sort of surrender to the process. But then once you're there, you ask this inquiry, and then you just sort of run on intuition, which for me is a massive intelligence that is underrated in our culture. And then once you're running on the intuition at the end, you don't necessarily have to know what everything means right at the time, but you will get some answers. And then over time, more answers reveal themselves. But what I think for me, what was the real sort of, I guess, cementing factor was that creativity starts pre-verbally.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes.
So can you run us through that? Because that's something I didn't know, which is that we're oftentimes in the process of writing or creating, thinking that we just, and it's pre-verbal, we may not actually have the words for a while. And I find this now when I write, which is I often will just say I do not have the words right now, and it takes me a while to sort of formulate the feeling or the intention I'm trying to convey.
Yes, this was so fascinating to me as well. And I have experienced this many times where you're in a group situation and there's like a brainstorm going on, right? Everyone's brainstorming ideas, there's a whiteboard, somebody's writing stuff, and you're just supposed to like shout out your best idea. And often what happens is people just shout out garbage, and you're just like...
Or you're running off like the signifier before you, where you're like, this made me think of this, and it has nothing to do with anything, but it's just like in the frequency
or
of like...
Or it's redundant. You're actually not creating anything. You're just saying things that you heard from somewhere kind of and remixing them. You know, it's not creative at all. And one of the things we know now is that inspiration and intuition happens before our brains form words. And so often when we're having a creative block, what's happening is we're trying to force the inspiration into words too soon. And there's like a short circuit in the brain where the brain hasn't figured out how does this inspiration, which usually comes in through a symbol. That's why we dream in pictures. You know, it comes through through the psyche, and it goes through a processing phase where it then becomes more defined to the point where then you can put it into words. And sometimes that takes seconds, minutes, weeks, years. You know, that process it depends on what the idea is. But if we force it into a sentence to be spoken immediately or too soon, it breaks off from the original inspiration, and you're actually not stating it at all. So it's really, that's why I've really gravitated toward this process, because sand play is not verbal. You're not speaking. You're actually using images to put together a sense of what is happening in your psyche. And then after it's finished, you start speaking about it, and that graduates the idea from the left side of your brain or from the right side of your brain to the left side of the brain.
Wild.
I know. It's silly we don't all know this, because it just makes ideation so much more effective.
Well, I mean, I think it's hard. I think the brain is so complex, and so we learn about different components of it, right? But these things that then apply specifically to our careers or our jobs, we may not have the information. And I think that was very valuable to me to be like, oh, if this starts pre-verbally, I don't have to rush the process. I can allow it to simmer and not speak of it until I have more clarity.
I cannot tell you how interesting it has been to observe how people's brain work in my studio. I have this theory that everybody has their own personal genius.
Oh, for sure. I 100% believe that. That's like one of my biggest things, is that everyone has their own personal genius, and they just have to figure out what it is.
Yeah.
And then if you find that, then like life becomes flow.
Yes.
And work is like, money is just a byproduct of living in your genius.
Yes, that's well said. Yeah, that's exactly right. I have observed how different people's creativity works, and it's almost geometric. You can almost define the way a lot of people work geometrically. Like, I had one person who was having panic attacks every time he sat down to write something, so he came in and we worked on his stuff, and what he discovered was his actual creative process requires chaos to start. He goes from chaos to order. And so his panic attacks were actually creating so much chaos in his life because everything got so jammed up. And that's when he could start to create, but he didn't know that.
Right.
And so he went into a panic state about it. Now that he knows that, he just allows chaos to happen, and he feels fine, and then he can create properly.
Well, I think it's also, we're taught that we, like, when we write, for example, it should be linear.
Right.
And I'm going through this process now, very, 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 very nascent stages of trying to write a book. And in this process, I was like, well, I'm not a linear writer, and I'm working with a coach. And she's like, well, maybe the book isn't linear. And I was like, what? Because my whole life I was told this is this way, and I was told by my family I'm not a great writer, blah, blah, blah. But my process is one that is disparate pieces that then I need to figure out how they come together. It's not a linear process by any means. Eventually I figure out how it's cohesive, how it works, what the through line is, what the story is. And for the sake of maybe this book, maybe it's not going to be a linear story. But it was such a relief to be given permission to say it doesn't have to be, maybe that's not what you're doing and you don't need to know yet. And so we talked about structure, and so we had to work through some pillars of ideas around structure. And then like a month in, I said, I'm abandoning structure for the moment. I'm just gonna write, and then we can figure out what it is later. I don't need to know right now, and I don't really care right now.
I love it.
And that release of not having it to be this thing, I think is such a gift, but I think in our culture we love frameworks. We love telling everyone they have to be one size fits all. This is the way you do things. And I think if we relinquish all of that, we can be our best creative selves. And so a lot of what you do is give people that permission to know that like their way is okay.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's not hard. It's not hard. I work in spirals, I recently discovered. I actually, now when I do my to-do list for every day, I write what I need to do on little pieces of paper, and then they arrange themselves in a spiral on the floor. There's actually two spirals. One goes this way and one goes this way. And I arrange the pieces like this, and then I can tell what I need to do in what order based on the spirals.
So interesting.
It is so interesting, because I used to be like, why do I start one thing and then I don't finish it, but I'll come back around to it in like a week or a month. And so I work on one thing, but I work on it incrementally. And I'm like, oh, it's because I work on one thing, but then I work on all the things, and I go around in a complete circle because I'm doing it all at one time. Even though the appearance is I don't finish anything, I actually do finish everything. I just finish everything at once.
So my schedule, the way I do it is I put in my phone, I have like my to-do list is in my schedule. And so as it's completed, it gets deleted off the schedule. And if
Ooh,
it's not
that's
done, it gets
satisfying.
put to the next day.
Oh, you have a rollover.
I'm a rollover. A lot gets done, but there's some like definite
Whatever
like
keeps
get
you
a
high,
new get a
that's the
new
important
driver's
thing.
license photo is a big rollover. Months and months and months.
I need to do it too.
Months and months of rollover. But the point is that's how I work. But everyone has like their little system of or
Yeah.
methodology that works for them, and that's one of the things like you can never judge as long as things are getting done. Who cares? But I think that in the corporate environment, for example, right, like that's not as accepted, and obviously some things are more prioritized. But everyone has a different process, and I think as long as it's done in a reasonable time frame,
Yeah.
we have to accept that people's flows look different.
I think there's a crazy amount of untapped potential because we're forcing people to work in a certain way. I mean, imagine if we had a system where people could discover how they worked and then be supported in working that way. I mean, imagine the efficiency if everyone was working inside their creative genius and they understood how it worked, like if they had them mapped to their own system.
Right. This was always my issue in corporate America was that I tend to be someone who can do an immense amount of work in a short amount of time. And so I was always done every day at work before everyone else, and I'd just be like, what else can I do? Waiting around. And it wasn't built for me. An 8-hour day is not built for me because I can like go do these massive spurts of huge amounts of work. And so I just was wasting a lot of brain space. And I felt like this was just like not, the 8-hour day was not constructed for me. And it wasn't until I became an entrepreneur and structured my days the way that I wanted to and had my hands in all different pots that all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm living the way I'm supposed to be living because I'm not meant to be doing one job 8 hours a day. I'm a multi-hyphenate who does multiple things and has the capacity for that. But I also structure my day that I sort of work in chunks across each cylinder. And so I think that for me was a big awakening when, it was a forced awakening when I kept getting, quitting or fired, that this wasn't for me. But the point was, it was a learning for me that I was just like, oh, I don't work like everybody else.
Yeah. Do you find you're more efficient when you're working in more categories? Like, do they inform each other?
They're all related, but I think for me, I appreciate diversification of inputs.
Yeah.
So a big part of what I do, right, for anything that I do, like writing, whatever, speaking, it's a lot of reading. I read a lot and I learn a lot to become more edified in different categories and then be a better orator or be a better just even like, advisor to companies, any of those things. But I find that without the input of books, I do myself a disservice in my categories. And I read like a book a week now. So I'm like, and I used to do that as a kid. But then through my 20s with work, I didn't have time, right?
Yeah.
And so once I reclaimed my time, it just came back.
Yeah, that's great. You've solved a lot of creative problems, like
Not by sheer
I'm
force.
excited for this book.
It wasn't like I solved them of like, oh, it's like no, like the universe hit me and hit me and hit me, and then I was like, you're gonna come to some conclusions. So if you look at every sort of part of your career, there's a through line. And I'm going to give you what my interpretation of through line is, then you can tell me what your interpretation of through line is.
Yeah.
But it's storytelling for me. I see in everything that you've done, there's storytelling is an important pillar. Before I ask my question, what do you think your through line is?
When people ask me, I say storytelling.
Good for me. Yes.
Yes.
Sick.
Like I don't mind whatever, if it's acting, if it's helping somebody else tell a story. I don't mind the role. I really think stories are so important.
They are. And before I get to my question, what I want to say is actually that what's so amazing about Kate is your ability to have so much joy for helping other people discover. Like you have such a zest and curiosity for life that you bring to your work in such a special way, which is like the process of your work is very joyful to you and people feel that. But I think the joy you just like derive the fun from being like, wow, I helped this person figure out this thing.
I do love it.
And it's very special, but I think that's when you're living in your genius, is when you feel that joy for the impact you create, but also in the process of what you're doing.
Thank you, yes.
So I just wanted to mention that because
Thank
I love that about you.
Thank you.
But why is storytelling so important to you?
I think storytelling is a critical tool for evolution. I think, especially if we're evolving consciously, if we're, the parts of us that have choice about how to evolve and how to participate in certain kinds of how we want to evolve our humanity, stories are really important. That we need to be told stories about who we are, about what we're doing, about what the possibilities are. I think it's critical. So that's why. I think it's, we need the mirror to see who we are so we can know who we want to be.
Storytelling is such a big part, I think, of a creative journey or even a business journey. I think that, you know, you have to be able to tell what your product is and tell the story correctly so people can understand it and learn from it. I think you're 100% right. I think communication and storytelling is what connects and also what gets us to think and what gets us to move forward.
Yeah, yeah.
What have been some of the coolest things that you've witnessed that have happened through your studio?
One of the coolest things that happens is that people realize they have a story and that their soul wants to tell it. And
So they don't know necessarily when they come in.
A lot of times people think they're writing a script, but it is tying them up in knots because their soul is trying to speak it in a certain way and they have resistance to it, or they can't hear their intuition because there's too much pressure from the outside.
Or surrender to the story. When I was building my company, which is an entertainment tech company, we worked with a lot of screenwriters, and a lot of screenwriters were writing the thing that they thought the industry would want.
Yes.
And they would...
It's a lot of gaslighting.
A lot of what they would ask me was like, well, what do you think I should write? Like, what do you think is selling in this market? And I was like, you need to write the thing that your heart's telling you to write, that you don't care if it sells or not, because you need to write it. Because that is the thing that always sells.
Right.
It's not the thing that you're writing to sell. It's a thing that you need to write.
Yeah, that is, I would say, I sort of have this visual that if we're a collective consciousness, if we're all related in a way that we can't totally feel, each of us has a seat in that consciousness, and that seat has the fire of inspiration behind it. So that's sort of where your soul lives, right? That's your soul is like feeling the world and the experience we're in a certain way. And if you are recognizing what that fire is, what lights you on fire, that is literally your conduit to everybody else, to the universality of everybody else. So yeah.
So oftentimes people come to your studio, you're helping them connect with that fire.
Yeah, exactly. And telling them that they're not crazy. And helping them see that. Yeah, and then helping the story come out, because a lot of times what happens is the story is more sophisticated than the person's personal evolution. So a story will come forward and the person doesn't know how to, hasn't heard this kind of story before, doesn't know how, doesn't understand it because it's beyond their imagination. And so part of my job is to help the person evolve, let the story evolve the person. It's like the person's writing the story, but the story is also writing the person.
Whoa.
Yeah, that happens a lot, especially for very creative people who are reaching, far boundaries, like challenging themselves to reach far boundaries. But it puts you in a crisis. Like if you have an ache to tell a story that has to be told, but you don't know how to, you're too stupid for your own story. Almost.
I mean, I feel that way writing a book, so I can tell you off the time, like, oh, good God.
Yes.
But I stopped judging myself, and I think that was a big part of it, which is like relinquish the judgment and just.
That's the best state. That's the highly creative state, because you are creating yourself. You are the story. You become the story as you're writing it.
What's helpful, and this is probably what you do for these people as well, is support them enough that they can do that. Because I think the greatest teachers or the greatest mentors are the people that they don't tell you, they don't blow smoke up your butt, right? Like they're being honest, but they tell you, oh, like my writing teacher, that this is good, this is good, this is where we can expand upon it, but the voice and the narrative, I'm into it.
Yeah.
And that for me was very helpful to be like, okay, so it's not like complete trash.
Right.
So I'm like, I don't know, it could be trash. I've never done this before. I do the same thing. I take voice lessons, same thing, and I have. Let's see. One day maybe I'll be a singer. Not today. Not today. We're getting better. We're getting better.
Yeah, we got a book. We got a performance coming. This is very exciting.
You just gotta follow the joy. So he always says form follows function. So don't worry about learn.
Follows function.
So learn the structure and rules of your throat and how it works in your voice, and then you can worry about style. Let's just understand the mechanics. And we're starting with the mechanics. And for someone that's not a singer, they don't know the mechanics. So I'm learning, and you can see how your voice evolves with the mechanics. And it's also been helpful to be like me coming in and be like, I'm not Whitney Houston. I'll never be Whitney Houston. I'm doing this for joy and process. But that being said, in the process, I'm realizing maybe I'm not as bad as I thought I was. But with the right support and the right guidance and teacher, I found that I'm able to relax into that state and just be process oriented.
Yeah. Yeah. There's,
It can be nonlinear. We've talked about this. We can start somewhere and connect it back.
No, because you asked me about like the coolest things
Yeah.
that happen in my studio. Because there's an element also of, and sort of what you're referring to is like there's a line between your work and your personal development. And a lot of times the stories that we're telling ourselves are personal, like what happened to me? What happened to me, and what does it mean? How did that create meaning in my life, and how did it create form in my life? And I had this family come in who had survived a crime. Somebody close to their family had driven one of their family members to suicide and then sort of taken over his empire. And it was all done, they didn't know the story of it. They didn't know, a lot of it was, done covertly, so they didn't understand what had happened to them, and they didn't understand who they were as a family. And so we started to work on their actual personal story, and it uncovered all these, it was sort of like a great reveal of all these players around them who had been exploiting them for years. They realized there was a huge narcissism wound within their own family. They started to just put pieces together about who they were and why the world was responding to them as it was. And once they had all the pieces, they had a huge lawsuit. And we wrote a huge document and gave it to lawyers, and like now they're going after this criminal who destroyed their family. So like, stories are potent. Stories are potent.
Also understanding the story and understanding yourself.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's a departure from sort of what you thought I think the studio
Yes.
would be about.
Yes.
And how satisfying.
Yes. I would say the studio has catered to creatives, entrepreneurs who are facing project blocks or personal or work transformations, and then anyone who is going through some kind of personal evolution and is in a state of confusion or, needs support. It's been such an adventure.
So cool.
Yeah.
So one of the things I deeply appreciate about you is your willingness to challenge convention and to do things your own way and not worry about, what feedback looks like. And you've been able to build a studio that's financially supports you, that's your own methodology that people have found. And that's a very hard thing to do, to build a business from scratch, to have the faith that people will find it and it will work. And for you, I think it's been also a lot of like word of mouth, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is amazing because like the product works, people speak about it, and it builds your business. But how do you think you are so comfortable with challenging convention?
Oh, I wouldn't challenge convention if I thought it worked. I'm not trying to be an outlier. I just really like efficiency. I would do it if I thought it worked. But yeah, my mind really analyzes systems, and if it doesn't work, it just makes me, I'm like, this could be improved upon so easily. So there's so many times that I wish I could tolerate convention a lot more than I do, because I'm like, do I have to invent everything from scratch, like everything? But yeah, that is how my life turned out.
But you're also open to like tinkering. Like I know even with the pay model of your company, you've tried different things. And I think it's so cool to be so open to being like, let's just see.
Yeah.
And not have the fear attached to, especially when it comes to like money, right? Like not have the fear attached to, well, let me play with this and maybe it won't work or maybe it will work. Most people would be like, there is a sense of security around, money. And so can you talk about like sort of the process of being like, I'm going to try and have faith?
Oh man, yeah, I'm in this, as you know, I'm doing this huge experiment with my own the economy of my business. And this all came about because I started to question what people were paying me for. Because if you're in the business of personal evolution or breakthrough, professional breakthrough, what we're really talking about is like the expansion of your being, so how do you
Quantify that.
Yeah, how do you do that? And then I thought, okay, well maybe they're paying me for my time. But then I'm like, well, my time is my time on earth. That's my existence. Like, what are we gonna put on that? Like $1 billion a minute for eternity? Like, for starters, like there's There's no price. So I was like, what are people paying me for? Like, how am I gonna price this? And then some people come to me for little tiny things, and some are big breakthroughs, some are small breakthroughs. So how do you quantify? So I developed a system where what you pay me is based on two things: emotion and intensity. And what I figured out was, my ideal client is open and willing and has a sense of adventure. That's a certain emotional field, right? And I also started to notice that when you pay for things, there is an emotion behind it. If you pay too much for something, it feels like a burden. It feels bad. And if you pay too little, it feels apathetic.
We also sometimes question too the things that are most fundamental for ourselves, whether it's like therapy or healers or like whatever people use. There's always well, that's so much money. Oh, that's so expensive.
Yes.
And it's like, for example, like there's a healer I know who charges like $120 for like 20 minutes. But she says, like, you'll see results in 3 to 5 sessions. And her job, as most great practitioners are, is that, like, I'm going to cook for you and then, or, like, teach you how to cook, and then you're not going to need me. That's the goal, right? Great practitioners are like, we're not building a 10-year relationship, because if I do my job right, you're not a client anymore. And so I was like, okay, $500 to change your life is how you have to look at it. But in the minute, you're like, $120 for 20 minutes?
Right.
That feels insane.
Right.
And then it's like, but that's but we feel resistance towards, honestly, is I think the value of sometimes the things that are most fundamentally changing us. We feel like, well, that feels very expensive. But it's like the best money you can spend.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very tricky, and it's very personal to people. People have all sorts of money issues around it. So finally, this is what I do now. I call this the kaleidoscope algorithm, because we're sort of like, you look through a kaleidoscope, and if you tick it one way, it changes the whole field. And if you tick it the another way, it changes the whole field. So we want to like find the right field that feels good to both people. We want openness, willingness, and then I also want to trust you. Like, that's actually really important for my work, because we can go deeper, farther, quicker if you trust me. So I thought, why not use the money? You can't pay me for my time or your breakthrough. Why not use the money as a creative tool? So here's what I do. People come in, they call and we have an intro conversation, and we talk about what they want to do. And I say, okay, now we're going to price your session. Each session has its own price. We're going to find the number for this session. And I say, I want you to write down a number that feels good, where you feel relaxed in your body, you feel open and willing to come through. Don't tell me what it is, just write it down. And I have them do like one that's really high, one that's really low, so they find the right number. And then I sort of tune into my emotions about, do I want to work with this person? Am I the right helper for this person? Do I have any images coming to me about what the experience of this person, working with this person, would be? And we have a little bit of a conversation. Like, sometimes I'll be like, I feel like there's a sense of betrayal for some reason. Like, can you speak I don't know what your number is, but I just feel, it feels bad to me. And they're like, oh, I felt it was too low, and so I made it, $100 higher, and so I'm confused about it. I'm like, okay. So if we start this session on a sense of your betrayal, that is going to be the fuel for our session, and I don't want to deal with that.
Yeah.
So I need you to come in with clean emotions. So like, find the number that feels good. You can adjust it at the end of the session. Don't worry about it. Just start with what feels good. They write it down. I agree. I don't know what the number is. I just agree to the emotion. And then I have them adjust it if they want their experience to be very intense or less intense, just depending on what the issue is. So we find the number. I agree to the number. I don't know what it is. We do the session. At the end of the session, they have an opportunity to adjust it higher or lower to keep it in integrity with what happened, and then they just pay it. So, a lot of people thought this was like such an insane way to set up a business, and I'm still experimenting with it. Like, the big question is this sustainable?
I just think it's interesting that you're willing to put your livelihood like up to risk. I think it's a very interesting, brave thing to do, to say, okay, I'm not going to charge rates that I know is going to, pay my bills every month. I'm going to see if this thing works.
Yeah.
And I think just in the process of experimentation and being an entrepreneur and an innovator, I find it very fascinating.
It's so fascinating, and I've gotten paid for the same amount of session, I've gotten paid $1,500 and $100.
Yeah.
I had someone who had a number and she's like, I don't know what the number is, but I want this thing done so badly, I'll give you $500,000. Where would that ever happen?
Yeah, totally.
So it's like, we're so scared to experiment. We don't think about like the benefits of what,
Totally.
like, if, you know.
Or how it evens out, because like some people have more money, some people have less money, and their understanding of money is different too. Because people that have
Yes.
more money, they don't think of $700 as a lot of money, but someone who has less money might, right?
Yes.
So I think that's an interesting thing. But I think this also hinges upon the fact that you are very intuitive and trust your intuition. And so how did you get to a place of trusting yourself that deeply?
I just thought, I'm building a business that is intuition based. What have I been doing here? Yeah, like if I'm asking people to trust me, I have to trust myself that, like I have to model it.
It's hard though.
It is so, no, it's, I agree, it's edgy, but it creates, you can feel the edge when people write down their numbers and they're like, oh my God, like they feel me in it with them. You know what I mean? Like if I'm putting myself on the line for what their process needs to transform them, then it's like rocket fuel.
But entrepreneurship is all about edges and being willing to face those edges. And so I
Yeah.
think like you're embodying that not only for the process for your people, but like also for yourself as a business owner and leader.
Yeah, and so many cool models have gone out of it. Like I have team members who they started out paying me each individually, but they all know each other. And so there started to be this shape between all of them and their individual work. And I changed the payment model to do cycles. And also within this pod, it's like, without even knowing it, one of them pays higher, one of them pays lower. Like they counterbalance each other. Yeah, so there are all sorts of financial models that are suddenly become available that do sustain me because they're working with a greater collective, and I'm not just expecting the client in front of me to pay my bills.
Right.
I'm looking at the whole collective.
Well, innovation and entrepreneurship is about iteration and it is about experimentation. And so I think that like I just think it's very cool, and I wanted people
Thank
to
you.
learn
I could
about
also be homeless. Like it's an experimentation phase.
But it's been going on for long enough that I think it's
Yeah.
interesting, and I think it's important for people to think about as they're building things, to not just do the linear or what they think works. There's like different ways of building financial models, and we tried a different one in my business that looked more like a venture capital portfolio. That was hard for people to understand from like a SaaS business. But I think that there's all these other things available to us if we're willing to just like think differently.
Yeah.
We're gonna jump into our rapid fire 5 questions.
Oh God, okay.
So just all you have to do is just speak from your intuition. You'll be fine. What would you tell your 20-year-old self?
I'm so sorry. It's going to be really hard for another 20 years.
I think that is the most pessimistic answer I've ever gotten.
I'm heartbroken for my 20-year-old self. It was rough times.
Oh.
I couldn't wait to be 40. When I was 20, I was like, when I'm 40, it'll be so much better. And it was.
Intuition
and now I'm
again.
like,
Intuition reigns.
60 is going to be so good. And then I'm like, but 80.
Oh my God.
80 is going to be awesome.
It will be.
Yeah.
When you love life, it's all awesome.
Yeah.
What is the last book you read?
Morphic Resonance by Rudolph Sheldrake.
Wow. Okay, that is one I will look up later. What are you struggling with right now?
My life doesn't feel like a struggle.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
You're in
Feels
flow.
It feels integrated.
I think that's beautiful. You know what? We'll take the moment of bliss
Okay.
that we're not struggling in this moment.
Okay. I could invent something now.
No, chef's kiss to that. That is a moment because we know you.
I can't fit in these pants. Maybe that's what.
We know you eventually will struggle again. So when we're riding the high and we're not struggling, we're going to take
Okay.
it because the struggle is inevitable. So we'll
Okay.
take the moment.
I literally was like, how do I expand but also contract? Like, how do I expand in my life but contract my body? That's what I was thinking in the car over today. I'm like, there's got to be a way. Anyway, I'm working
Patriarchal
on it.
society.
I'm struggling with
But
that.
Just patriarchal society talking to women, but you're fine. What is bringing you joy right now?
Everything. The possibility of my work.
I love that.
Yeah, I'm in love with it.
And what is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Sometimes you're so far into a black hole that it's impossible to pull yourself out, and you just have to go all the way through the center and dissolve yourself until you come out the other side.
That's right, the only way is through. spending time with you in conversation is like so fun. It's so fun for me. So
Delighted.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this whole event.
This was awesome, and I can't wait for everyone to meet you.
Thank you so much.
Yay!